Sarah Mitchell stared at the foreclosure notice in her trembling hands, the words blurring as tears threatened to spill down her cheeks. After 8 years of marriage and countless promises from her husband that he would stop gambling, she was about to lose the only home her 10-year-old daughter had ever known. What she didn't know was that in just 3 days, a patient assignment during her night shift would change everything. A man who owned half of downtown Chicago's real estate would walk into her life, and what started as professional care would become the love story that saved not just her house, but her heart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The November rain hammered against the windows of the small ranch house on Maple Street as Sarah Mitchell sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by a mountain of bills that seemed to multiply every time she looked away. Her nurse's uniform hung over the back of a chair, still damp from her rushed walk between the hospital parking garage and the emergency room entrance where she'd pulled another double shift just hours before. The coffee in her mug had gone cold long ago, but she barely noticed as she tried to make sense of the numbers that refused to add up, no matter how many times she rearranged them. At 34, Sarah carried herself with the quiet strength that came from years of caring for others while her own world slowly crumbled around her. Her auburn hair was pulled back in the same practical ponytail she'd worn since nursing school, and her brown eyes held a weariness that seemed too deep for someone who should have been in the prime of her life. The laugh lines around her eyes had been earned through countless moments of bringing comfort to patients and their families, but lately, those lines seemed more like permanent creases of worry. She picked up the foreclosure notice again, reading the same devastating words. For the 100th time. 60 days. That's all the time she had to come up with 3 months of missed mortgage payments, plus penalties and legal fees. The total amount might as well have been $1 million for all the hope she had of raising it. Jake had sworn the poker game was a sure thing, that his friend Tommy had insider information about which cards were coming up. Instead, he'd lost the last of their savings and borrowed against the house without telling her. The sound of footsteps on the front porch made her quickly fold the notice and stuff it into her purse. Emma's bus was running late because of the weather, and Sarah didn't want her daughter to see the panic that threatened to overwhelm her every time she thought about how to explain that they might have to leave their home. The key turned in the lock, and Emma burst through the door with the infectious energy that only 10-year-olds seemed to possess. Her backpack nearly as big as she was, and her dark hair escaping from the braids. Sarah had carefully woven that. "Morning. Mom, you'll never guess what happened in science class today," Emma announced, dropping her backpack by the door and launching into an animated story about a volcano experiment that had gone spectacularly wrong. Sarah found herself smiling for the first time all day as she listened to her daughter's enthusiasm, grateful for this pocket of normalcy in the chaos that had become their lives. "That sounds amazing, sweetheart," Sarah said, ruffling Emma's hair. "Why don't you get started on your homework while I figure out dinner?" Emma nodded and settled at the table where Sarah had been reviewing bills just moments before. As her daughter pulled out math worksheets and reading assignments, Sarah moved to the refrigerator and assessed their options. The contents were sparse, a consequence of stretching every dollar until it screamed, but she could make something work. She always did. The sound of a car door slamming outside made them both look up. Through the window, Sarah could see Jake climbing out of his beat-up sedan, and even from a distance, she could read the defeat in his posture. Her stomach clenched as she watched him walk slowly toward the house, his shoulders hunched against the rain. 3 days ago, he'd left with promises that he was going to fix everything, that he had a plan to get them caught up on the mortgage. Now, looking at his face as he approached the front door, Sarah knew that whatever plan he'd had failed spectacularly. "Hey, Dad," Emma called out cheerfully when Jake walked through the door, oblivious to the tension that immediately filled the room. "Hey, Princess," Jake replied, forcing a smile for his daughter's benefit. He was still handsome at 36, with the easy charm that had first attracted Sarah when they'd met in college. But years of gambling addiction had worn away at him, in ways that went deeper than physical appearance. The confidence that had once made him magnetic now felt brittle, and the smile he gave Emma didn't quite reach his eyes. Sarah waited until Emma was absorbed in her homework before nodding toward the kitchen, silently asking Jake to follow her. He did, his footsteps heavy on the linoleum floor, and she could see him struggling to find words that would somehow make the situation better. "The loan didn't come through," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "They said my credit score is too low and without collateral." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the last flutter of hope die in her chest. She'd known it was a long shot, but some small part of her had dared to believe that, maybe just this once, Jake's promises would turn into reality. "How much time do we have?" she asked, proud of how steady her voice sounded when everything inside her was screaming. "The foreclosure notice said 60 days, but the lawyer I talked to thinks we might be able to get an extension if we can. Show good faith, maybe make a partial payment," Jake said, running his hands through his hair in a gesture Sarah recognized as his tell when he was overwhelmed. "With what money?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, and she saw Jake flinch. "I'm already working doubles almost every day, and we're barely covering groceries and utilities." Jake's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like the broken man he truly was underneath all the bravado and promises. "I know I messed up, Sarah. I know I've been messing up for years, but I can fix this. I just need more time." "Time for what?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice down so Emma wouldn't hear. "Time to find another poker game? Time to convince yourself that the next bet is going to be the one that saves us?" "That's not fair," Jake said, but his protest sounded weak even to his own ears. "What's not fair is that I work my ass off every day taking care of other people, while my own family falls apart," Sarah replied, years of frustration and disappointment finally spilling over. "What's not fair is that Emma might have to change schools in the middle of the year because her father can't stop gambling away our future." The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows and Emma's pencil scratching against her homework in the next room. Sarah stared at Jake, seeing not the man she'd fallen in love with in college, but a stranger who'd worn his face while systematically destroying everything they built together. "I'm going to Gamblers Anonymous," Jake said suddenly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I already called them, and there's a meeting tomorrow night. I know I've said this before, but this time is different. Losing the house, seeing what I've done to you and Emma, it's finally hit me how bad this has gotten." Sarah wanted to believe him. Despite everything, despite all the broken promises and sleepless nights, some part of her still loved the man Jake had been before gambling had consumed him. But she'd heard variations of this speech so many times that the words felt hollow, like echoes of hope that had died long ago. "I have to get ready for work," she said finally, not trusting herself to say anything else. Her shift at St. Mary's started at 11, and she needed time to decompose from this conversation before she walked into the hospital and put on the caring, competent face that her patients depended on. Jake nodded, understanding that the conversation was over, at least for now. "I'll help Emma with her homework and get her dinner." Sarah was already walking toward the bedroom when she heard Emma's voice from the kitchen. "Dad, why do you and Mom look so sad?" She paused in the hallway, waiting to hear how Jake would answer, praying he wouldn't burden their daughter with the weight of their adult problems. "Just some grown-up stuff, Princess," Jake said, and Sarah could hear him, forcing lightness into his tone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Nothing for you to worry about. In her bedroom, Sarah changed into fresh scrubs and tried to push thoughts of foreclosure notices and gambling debts out of her mind. She'd learned over the years that she couldn't carry her personal problems into work with her. Her patients deserved better than a distracted nurse, and focusing on their needs gave her a few hours of respite from her own troubles. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave for another long night at the hospital, Sarah had no idea that this shift would be different from all the others. She didn't know that a patient assignment in the VIP wing would introduce her to a man who would change not just her financial situation, but her entire understanding of what her life could become. All she knew was that she had to keep putting one foot in front of the other, keep working, keep fighting for her daughter's future, even when her own seemed to be slipping away one bill at a time. The drive to St. Mary's Hospital took 20 minutes through the quiet streets of suburban Chicago, and Sarah used the time to mentally prepare for whatever the night might bring. November had been particularly brutal for emergencies, with early winter weather causing accidents and the approaching holidays putting stress on families that often resulted in domestic disputes and mental health crises. As a nurse with 8 years of experience, Sarah had seen it all, but she never stopped feeling the weight of each patient's pain as if it were her own. The hospital parking garage was dimly lit and nearly empty when she arrived, her footsteps echoing off the concrete walls as she made her way to the employee entrance. The night shift was always quieter than days, but it brought its own challenges. Fewer staff meant more responsibility for each nurse, and the patients who came in after midnight were often dealing with the kinds of problems that couldn't wait until morning. Inside the hospital, the familiar smells of disinfectant and floor wax greeted her, along with the constant hum of equipment and muffled conversations that never really stopped, even in the middle of the night. The nurse's station was a hub of controlled activity, with her colleagues updating charts, reviewing medication schedules, and preparing for the long hours ahead. "Sarah, thank God you're here," called out Lisa Chun, her closest friend at the hospital and the one person who knew the full extent of what was happening at home. Lisa was everything Sarah was not, tiny and energetic with perfectly styled black hair and a wardrobe that somehow managed to make scrubs look fashionable. They'd been friends since Sarah's first day at St. Mary's, when Lisa had taken her under her wing and taught her the unwritten rules of hospital politics. "Let me guess," Sarah said, clocking in and checking the assignment board. "Short-staffed again? When are we not?" Lisa replied with a laugh that held no humor. "But tonight's different. We've got a VIP patient in the private wing, and guess who drew the short straw?" Sarah looked at the assignment sheet and saw her name next to room 815, the largest and most expensive private room in the hospital. VIP patients were rare on the night shift, usually business people or celebrities who wanted privacy during their stay. They often demanded more attention and had expectations that went beyond standard medical care. "What's wrong with him?" Sarah asked, scanning the medical chart. "Minor cardiac episode during a business dinner," Lisa explained. "Stress-related, they think. He's stable, but they want continuous monitoring for the next few days. Word from upstairs is that he's some kind of real estate big shot, and the hospital administration is very interested in keeping him happy." Sarah nodded, understanding the subtext. VIP patients often meant generous donations to the hospital, and keeping them satisfied was considered a priority by the administrators who rarely had to deal with the day-to-day reality of patient care. "Any special instructions?" she asked, though she hoped the answer would be no. She had enough to worry about without dealing with a demanding patient who expected 5-star hotel service in a hospital setting. "Just the usual," Lisa said. "Regular vitals, medication monitoring, and try to keep him from working. Apparently, he's been trying to conduct business meetings from his hospital bed, and his doctor wants him to rest." Sarah gathered the necessary supplies and made her way to the VIP wing, a section of the hospital that felt more like an upscale hotel than a medical facility. The floors were carpeted instead of linoleum, The walls were painted in soothing colors instead of institutional white, and each room had amenities like flat-screen televisions and comfortable chairs for visitors. Room 815 was at the end of the hallway, and as Sarah approached, she could hear a man's voice speaking in low, urgent tones. She knocked softly and waited for permission to enter, a courtesy that was standard in the VIP wing, but not always observed. In the regular hospital rooms, where privacy was a luxury few could afford. "Come in," the voice called, and Sarah pushed open the door to find a man in his early 40s sitting up in bed, a cell phone pressed to his ear, and several manila folders spread across the bedside table. He had dark hair with just enough silver at the temples to suggest distinguished rather than old, and green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Despite being in a hospital gown, he somehow managed to project an aura of authority and control. "I don't care what time it is in Tokyo," he was saying into the phone, his tone suggesting this was a conversation he'd had many times before. "The Henderson deal closes tomorrow, or we lose the property to the Nakamura Group. Figure it out." He noticed Sarah standing by the door and held up one finger in a gesture that seemed more apologetic than dismissive. She'd dealt with enough VIP patients to recognize the type, men who were accustomed to being the most important person in any room and who struggled with the vulnerability that came with being a patient. "Mr. Romano," she said once he'd ended the call, reading his name from the chart. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, your night nurse. How are you feeling?" David Romano looked at her with the kind of direct gaze that suggested he was accustomed to quickly assessing people in situations. "Better than my cardiologist would like me to admit," he said with a slight smile, "and probably not as well as I'm pretending to be." The honesty in his answer surprised Sarah. Most VIP patients either downplayed their symptoms to prove they were tough enough to handle anything, or exaggerated them to ensure they received maximum attention. David Romano seemed to be doing neither. "Well, let's check your vitals and see what the numbers tell us," Sarah said, moving to his bedside and beginning the familiar routine of checking blood pressure, heart rate, and oxygen levels. As she worked, she was aware that he was watching her with the same intensity he'd probably brought to his business dealings. "You've been here long?" he asked as she wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm. 8 years, Sarah replied, focusing on the digital readout. His numbers were better than they'd been when he was admitted, but still elevated enough to warrant continued monitoring. "Night shift by choice. It pays better," Sarah said simply, not wanting to get into the personal details that had made those extra dollars per hour a necessity rather than a preference. David nodded as if that answer told him more than she'd intended to reveal. "The differential isn't much, though. Maybe $1 or $2 an hour." Sarah was surprised that he knew enough about hospital staffing to be aware of shift differentials. Most VIP patients were so removed from the daily realities of working life that they had no idea what people earned or why they made the choices they did. "Every dollar helps," she said, checking his for and making notes on his chart. "It does." David agreed, and something in his tone made her look up. For just a moment, his polished exterior slipped, and she caught a glimpse of someone who understood financial pressure in a way that seemed at odds with his expensive watch and the deference the hospital staff was showing him. "Your heart rate is still a bit elevated," Sarah said, returning to professional territory. "Dr. Martinez wants you to avoid stress for the next few days, which probably means no business calls after 10 p.m. David glanced at his phone, which had been buzzing constantly since she'd entered the room. "That's going to be difficult. I'm in the middle of several deals that need constant attention." "Mr. Romano," Sarah said, her voice taking on the firm but caring tone she used with patients who needed to be talked out of behaviors that could harm their recovery. "You're here because your heart gave you a warning. You can choose to listen to that warning, or you can choose to ignore it and end up back here with something much more serious." David studied her face, And Sarah had the strange feeling that he was seeing her in a way that went beyond the typical patient-nurse interaction. "You don't pull punches, do you? Would you prefer that I did?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Most people appreciate honesty when it comes to their health. Most people lie to themselves about everything that matters. David replied, and again Sarah caught that glimpse of someone more complicated than the successful businessman facade. Suggested. She finished her initial assessment and was preparing to leave when David spoke again. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" She turned back, noting that he'd used her first name instead of the formal nurse that most VIP patients preferred. "Of course. Do you like what you do? Nursing, I mean? Not just the paycheck, but the work itself." The question caught her off guard. In 8 years, no patient had ever asked her that, and she found herself considering her answer more carefully than she'd expected. "I do," she said finally. "I like feeling like I'm making a difference, even if it's just for one person at a time. There's something satisfying about helping someone through the worst day of their life and knowing that you made it a little easier." David nodded slowly, as if her answer had confirmed something he'd been thinking. "That must be rewarding." "It is," Sarah agreed. "Though it doesn't always feel that way at 3 in the morning when you're dealing with your 5th emergency of the shift." She realized she'd said more than she'd intended, crossing the invisible line that usually separated professional interaction from personal conversation. Something about David Romano invited confidences in a way that felt both comfortable and dangerous. "I should let you rest," she said, stepping back toward the door. "I'll check on you again in a couple of hours." "Sarah," David called as she reached the doorway. "Thank you for treating me like a person instead of a diagnosis." She smiled, surprised by how much his words meant to her. "That's what good nursing is, Mr. Romano. Rest well." As she walked back down the hallway toward the nurse's station, Sarah found herself thinking about the man in room 815 in a way that had nothing to do with his medical care. There had been something in his eyes, a loneliness that seemed at odds with his obvious success, that reminded her of her own feelings of isolation, even when surrounded by people who cared about her. She shook off the thought as she returned to her other patients. But throughout the rest of her shift, she found herself looking forward to her next check on David Romano in a way that felt both professional and something else entirely. The second night of David Romano's stay brought with it a different energy. Sarah could feel it the moment she walked into his room for her initial assessment. He was sitting by the window instead of in bed, dressed in a simple gray sweater and dark pants that somehow managed to look expensive despite their casual appearance. The ever-present stack of business documents was notably absent from his bedside table. "Mr. Romano, you should be resting," Sarah said, though her tone lacked the stern authority she'd used the previous evening. Something about the way he was, gazing out at the city lights, suggested a man deep in thought rather than one ignoring medical advice. "I couldn't sleep," David admitted, turning to face her. "Every time I close my eyes, my mind starts racing through tomorrow's meetings, next week's deadlines, next month's acquisitions. It's like my brain doesn't have an off switch." Sarah moved closer, noting the dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there during his admission. "When was the last time you took a real vacation? Not a business trip disguised as leisure, but actual time off where you weren't thinking about work at all?" David was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the window. "I honestly can't remember. 5 years, maybe 6. There was a weekend in Aspen, but I spent most of it on conference calls." "That's not a vacation, that's a change of scenery," Sarah said, beginning her routine of checking his vitals. "Your body is telling you it needs rest, Mr. Romano. The question is whether you're going to listen." "David," he corrected gently. "And you're right, but knowing something intellectually and being able to actually do it are two different things. I've built my entire life around being indispensable, around being the person who has all the answers and makes all the decisions. I don't know how to just Stop. Sarah paused in her examination, struck by the vulnerability in his voice. In her years as a nurse, she'd learned to read the subtle signs of what patients weren't saying. And David Romano was carrying a burden that went far beyond the physical symptoms that had brought him to the hospital. Maybe stopping isn't the goal, she said thoughtfully. Maybe the goal is learning to slow down enough to remember why you started building all of this in the first place. David looked at her with surprise, as if she'd said something profound instead of simply offering the kind of perspective that came naturally to someone who'd spent years helping people through difficult transitions. What made you want to become a nurse? He asked, settling back into the chair beside the window. It's not exactly the kind of career people dream about as children. Sarah smiled, remembering her own childhood fantasies of becoming a veterinarian or a teacher. I was 8 when my grandmother had her first heart attack. She spent weeks in the hospital, and I remember being terrified every time we visited. But there was this one nurse, Mrs. Patterson, who always took time to explain what all the machines did, who made sure my grandmother's hair looked nice even when she was too weak to care for herself. She made the scariest experience of my childhood feel manageable. So you wanted to be like her, David said, and Sarah noticed that he was listening with the kind of focused attention that made her feel like her words mattered. I wanted to be the person who made other people feel less afraid, Sarah said. It sounds simple when I say it like that, but it's really what drew me to nursing. The idea that I could use my hands and my heart to help people through the worst moments of their lives. And do you feel like you're making a difference, I mean? Sarah considered the question seriously, thinking about the countless patients she'd cared for over the years, the families she'd comforted, the small victories that kept her coming back, despite the long hours and emotional exhaustion. Most days, yes, she said honestly. Even when I can't cure someone or take away their pain completely, I can usually find a way to make things a little better. Sometimes that's as simple as bringing an extra blanket or staying to talk when someone is scared. It's not glamorous work, but it matters. David nodded slowly, and Sarah had the sense that he was filing away her words for later consideration. What about the days when you don't feel like you're making a difference? The question hit closer to home than Sarah was comfortable with, touching on the frustration she felt when bureaucracy got in the way of patient care. When insurance companies denied treatments she knew would help, when she watched good people suffer because they couldn't afford the care they needed. Those are the hard days, she admitted. When you know what someone needs but you can't provide it because of policies or procedures or just plain bad luck. When you have to watch people make impossible choices between their health and their financial security. Something in her voice must have betrayed more than she'd intended, because David's attention sharpened in a way that made her realize she'd revealed something personal without meaning to. Is that something you've had to deal with personally? He asked gently. Sarah felt her cheeks warm, realizing she'd allowed her own situation to color her professional response. She rarely shared personal information with patients, maintaining the kind of boundaries that protected both her emotional well-being and her professional credibility. I think everyone in healthcare has seen how financial stress can complicate medical care, she said carefully, trying to redirect the conversation back to safer territory. But David Romano hadn't built a successful business empire by missing subtle cues, and Sarah could see in his expression that her non-answer had told him more than a direct response might have. Sarah, he said, using her first name with a familiarity that felt both inappropriate and strangely comforting. I hope you know that anything you share with me stays between us. I'm not asking out of idle curiosity. There's something about the way you talk about financial pressure that suggests you understand it from experience, not just observation. Sarah found herself in an impossible position. Every instinct told her to maintain professional distance, to deflect his questions with polite but firm boundaries. But something about David's manner, the genuine concern in his voice, and the way he'd listened to her earlier words, made her want to trust him with truths she'd been carrying alone for too long. "My husband has a gambling problem," she said. Quietly, the words feeling strange on her tongue. She'd never said it so directly to anyone outside her immediate family, never acknowledged the reality so starkly to someone who could judge her for staying, for trying, for the countless ways. She'd enabled Jake's addiction by covering for him. David's expression didn't change, but she saw something shift in his eyes, a recognition that suggested he understood the weight of what she'd just shared. "How long?" he asked simply. 3 years since it got really bad," Sarah said, surprised by how relieved she felt to speak the truth aloud. "Maybe longer, but 3 years since I couldn't pretend it was just occasional bad luck anymore. He's lost jobs, borrowed money from family, run up credit cards. Last week I found out he'd been gambling with the mortgage payments." The silence that followed felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. David seemed to be processing her words with the same careful consideration he'd probably give to a complex business problem, looking for solutions rather than passing judgment. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, voicing the uncertainty that had been eating at her for weeks. "I've been working extra shifts to try to catch up on the bills, but it's like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. Every time I think we might be getting ahead, something else happens. Have you considered leaving him?" The question was direct but not unkind, and Sarah appreciated that David didn't try to soften it with platitudes about marriage being hard work or gambling being a disease that could be overcome with enough love and support. "Every day," she said honestly. "But we have a daughter, and she adores her father despite everything. And there's this part of me that remembers who Jake was before the gambling took over, who still believes that person is in there somewhere, waiting to come back." "That must be exhausting," David said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he understood the burden of hope deferred, of holding on to faith in someone who kept disappointing you. "It is," Sarah agreed. "Some days I feel like I'm drowning, like I'm working so hard to keep everyone else afloat that I've forgotten how to swim myself." She realized as she spoke that she'd never articulated her feelings so clearly, even to herself. The conversation with David was forcing her to examine her situation with a clarity that was both painful and liberating. "Can I ask you something?" David said, leaning forward slightly in his chair. Sarah nodded, curious about what he wanted to know. "Why are you telling me this? I'm essentially a stranger, and you seem like someone who's very careful about maintaining professional boundaries." It was a fair question, and one that Sarah had been asking herself since the words had started spilling out. Why was she confiding in this man she'd known for less than 24 hours? What was it about David Romano that made her feel safe enough to share her most private struggles? "I think it's because you listen," she said after considering for a moment. "Really listen, not just wait for your turn to talk. And because you asked questions that suggested you actually care about the answers, not just making conversation to pass the time." "I do care," David said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made Sarah's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Why?" she asked, genuinely curious. "You don't know me, and my problems aren't your responsibility." David was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the city lights outside the window. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was sharing something significant. "When I was 12, my father lost his job at the steel mill," he said. "Not because of gambling, but because the plant closed and there was nowhere else in town that paid enough to support a family. I watched my parents try everything to keep our house, watched my mother work 3 part-time jobs while my father drove to the next county every day looking for work that didn't exist." Sarah found herself holding her breath, sensing that David was about to share something he rarely talked about. "We lost the house anyway," he continued. "Ended up moving in with my uncle's family in a 2-bedroom apartment that was already too small for the people who lived there. I slept on the couch for 2 years, listening to my parents whisper about money every night, watching my mother count pennies to see if we could afford milk for my cereal. "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly, understanding now why her situation had resonated with him so deeply. "The thing is, it wasn't anyone's fault," David said, turning back to look at her. "My parents were good people who worked hard and made responsible choices, but sometimes the system is rigged against people like that. Sometimes bad things happen to good people, and all the hard work in the world isn't enough to fix it." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, not just for the 12-year-old boy who'd lost his home, but for the recognition that someone finally understood the helplessness she'd been fighting against for so long. "But you built yourself back up," she said, gesturing toward the expensive clothes and the deference he commanded from the hospital staff. "You found a way to make sure that would never happen to you again." "I did," David agreed. "I worked scholarships and student loans to get through college, slept in my car some nights to save money on rent, spent every free moment learning about real estate and business development. I swore that I would never be powerless again, never have to watch someone I loved suffer because I couldn't provide for them." "And now you own half of downtown Chicago," Sarah said with a small smile. "Something like that," David said, returning her smile. "But you know what I learned along the way? Building walls to protect yourself from one kind of pain often means building walls that keep out everything else too. I'm 42 years old, and I've never had a relationship that lasted longer than 6 months. I've never had someone I could trust with the kind of honesty you just showed me." The admission hung in the air between them, creating an intimacy that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Sarah realized that their conversation had crossed every professional boundary she'd ever maintained, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen by another person, understood in a way that went beyond surface pleasantries and social expectations. "This is probably inappropriate," she said, voicing the concern that was nagging at the back of her mind. "Probably," David agreed. "Does that bother you?" Sarah considered the question seriously, weighing her professional obligations against the connection she felt with this man who seemed to understand her struggles in a way that even her closest friends couldn't. "It should," she said finally. "But no, it doesn't bother me. For the first time in months, I feel like I'm having a conversation with someone who sees me as more than just a nurse, or a wife, or a mother trying to hold everything together." "What do you see when you look in the mirror?" David asked, and the question caught her off guard with its directness. Sarah thought about the woman who'd stared back at her that morning while she got ready for another shift. Tired eyes and worry lines that seemed to deepen daily. "Someone who's trying her best but isn't sure it's enough," she said honestly. "Someone who used to have dreams but hasn't thought about them in so long. She's not sure she remembers what they were." "What were your dreams?" David asked, and something about the way he asked made it clear that he wanted a real answer, not the safe response she might give to a casual acquaintance. Sarah found herself thinking back to nursing school, to the idealistic young woman who'd believed she could change the world one patient at a time. She'd wanted to travel, maybe work with Doctors Without Borders, or provide medical care in underserved communities. She'd imagined herself making a difference on a scale larger than the night shift at a suburban hospital. "I wanted to do medical mission work," she said, surprised by how clearly the memory came back to her. "I had this fantasy of working in remote villages, bringing healthcare to people who had never seen a doctor, teaching local communities how to prevent disease and care for each other." "What stopped you?" David asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Life," Sarah said with a rueful laugh. "I met Jake in my last semester of nursing school, and he had his own dreams of starting a construction business. We got married right after graduation, bought a house, had Emma. The mission work required being single and mobile, and by the time I might have been ready to try it, I had responsibilities that made it impossible." "Do you regret it?" David asked. choosing family over adventure? Sarah thought about Emma's laugh, about the moments of joy that punctuated even the most difficult days, about the satisfaction she found in her work even when it wasn't the grand adventure she'd once imagined. "No," she said definitively. "I love being Emma's mother, and I love the work I do here. I think I was just remembering what it felt like to have dreams that belonged entirely to me, before I learned to think of myself as part of a unit." "Dreams don't have expiration dates," David said quietly. "They just sometimes need to be reimagined to fit the life you've actually built." The observation was simple but profound, and Sarah found herself considering what a reimagined version of her dreams might look like. Could she find ways to do meaningful work within her current circumstances? Were there opportunities she'd been too overwhelmed to notice? Before she could respond, the sound of her pager beeping interrupted the moment. Sarah glanced at the display and saw that she was needed in room 803, where another patient was experiencing complications that required immediate attention. "I have to go," she said, reluctantly returning to the professional reality that had been temporarily suspended by their conversation. "Of course," David said, standing as she gathered her equipment. "Thank you, Sarah, for listening, for sharing, for treating me like a person instead of a collection of symptoms." "Thank you for the same," Sarah replied, meaning it more than she could express. As she walked toward the door, David called her name one more time. "Sarah, what you're going through with your husband, with the financial pressure, it doesn't define you. You're stronger than you know, and you're worth more than the situation you're in." Sarah paused at the doorway, feeling tears threaten again at the simple kindness of his words. "How can you be sure about that? You barely know me." "Because I've spent my career reading people, understanding what drives them and what holds them back," David said. "And everything about you tells me you're someone who's been putting everyone else's needs before your own for so long that you've forgotten your own value. But it's there, Sarah. It's absolutely there." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to respond without breaking, and slipped out of the room to attend to her other patient. But as she hurried down the hallway, David's words echoed in her mind, planting seeds of possibility in soil that had been barren for far too long. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of routine tasks and patient care, but Sarah found her thoughts returning again and again to the man in room 815, who'd listened to her story without judgment and offered her a perspective on herself that she'd lost somewhere along the way. She realized that in less than 2 days, David Romano had done something that years of therapy and countless conversations with friends had failed to accomplish. He'd reminded her that she was more than the sum of her problems, more than the roles she played for other people. When her shift ended at 7 in the morning, Sarah found herself reluctant to leave the hospital, knowing that her next assignment would likely be to a different section and that her time caring for David Romano was probably coming to an end. The thought left her with a strange sense of loss, as if she were saying goodbye to a friend she'd only just discovered. As she gathered her things from her locker, Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. Tomorrow night, when she returned for her next shift, she would ask for David Romano to remain her patient. She would find a reason, create a justification, call in favors if necessary. Because for the first time in years, she'd found someone who saw her potential instead of just her problems, and she wasn't ready to let that go. Sarah's request to continue caring for David Romano raised eyebrows among the nursing staff, but her reputation for excellence and 8 years of dedicated service earned her the assignment she'd asked for. When she walked into room 815 on her third night, she found David pacing by the window, his phone pressed to his ear and his free hand gesturing emphatically as he spoke. "No, Marcus, that's not what we agreed on," David was saying, his voice carrying the edge of frustration that Sarah hadn't heard before. "The Riverside property was supposed to close escrow today, and now you're telling me the buyers are asking for another inspection?" What kind of amateur hour operation are you running? Sarah cleared her throat softly to announce her presence, but David was too absorbed in his conversation to notice. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched as he listened to whatever explanation was being offered on the other end of the line. I don't care if they're offering full asking price, David continued, his pace quickening as his agitation grew. If they can't commit to a timeline, then they're not serious buyers. Find someone who is. The heart monitor beside his bed began beeping more rapidly, and Sarah realized that his stress levels were spiking dangerously. She moved quickly to the bedside, checking the readings and seeing numbers that made her concerned about the possibility of another cardiac episode. "Mr. Romano," she said firmly, loud enough to penetrate his concentration. "I need you to end that call right now." David turned toward her, irritation flashing in his eyes at the interruption, but Sarah held his gaze steadily, pointing meaningfully toward the monitor that was now beeping insistently. "Marcus, I have to go," David said. Into the phone, his tone immediately shifting as he recognized the seriousness in Sarah's expression. "Handle the Riverside situation however you think best, and we'll discuss it tomorrow." He ended the call and moved toward the bed, but Sarah could see that his breathing was shallow and his color was off. The stress of the business call had pushed his system beyond what his recovering heart could handle comfortably. "Sit down," Sarah instructed, pulling out her stethoscope and blood pressure cuff. "And don't tell me you feel fine, because your vital signs are telling a different story." David settled onto the edge of the bed, allowing her to check his blood pressure without protest. The reading was elevated enough to warrant concern, and Sarah made a note to call his cardiologist if it didn't come down within the next hour. "How long were you on that call?" she asked, wrapping the cuff around his arm for a second reading. "Maybe 20 minutes, David admitted. "Probably longer. I lost track of time." "What did Dr. Martinez tell you about managing stress during your recovery?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from his medical chart. "To avoid it completely for at least a week," David said with a rueful smile. "Which is easier said than done when you're running multiple real estate developments and your staff keeps calling with problems they should be able to solve themselves." Sarah finished taking his blood pressure and was relieved to see that it had come down slightly, though it was still higher than she would have liked. She made another note on his chart and then turned to face him directly. "David, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly," she said, using his first name without thinking about it. "When was the last time you delegated real authority to someone else? Not just tasks or projects, but actual decision-making power." The question seemed to catch him off guard, and Sarah could see him considering his response carefully. "I'm not sure I ever have," he admitted finally. "I mean, I have department heads and project managers, but I'm involved in every major decision. It's my company, my reputation, my money on the line. And how's that working out for your health?" Sarah asked pointedly. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Obviously not well, since I'm sitting in a hospital room at 2 in the morning being lectured by my nurse about delegation." "I'm not lecturing you," Sarah said, settling into the chair beside his bed. "I'm trying to understand why someone as intelligent as you are keeps making choices that are clearly harmful to your well-being." The directness of her statement seemed to surprise David, and Sarah realized she was speaking to him with a familiarity that went far beyond their professional relationship. But instead of pulling back, she found herself leaning in, genuinely curious about what drove him to push himself so relentlessly. "Control," David said simply. "If I'm not involved in every decision, if I'm not monitoring every detail, then things go wrong. People make mistakes that cost money, damage relationships, hurt the business I've spent 20 years building." "So you'd rather risk your life than risk a business deal going badly?" Sarah asked. "It's not that simple, David. protested, but Sarah could see uncertainty in his expression, as if he was questioning his own logic for the first time. "Isn't it?" Sarah challenged. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're so afraid of losing control that you're controlling yourself right into an early grave." David was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. When he looked up again, Sarah was struck by the vulnerability in his expression. "What if I delegate and everything falls apart?" he asked. "What if the people I trust make decisions that destroy what I've built? I've seen it happen to other companies. Other entrepreneurs who thought they could step back and let others handle the details." Sarah found herself thinking about her own relationship with control, about the way she'd tried to manage Jake's gambling addiction by taking on more responsibility, working more hours, trying to earn enough money to compensate for his losses. The parallel wasn't exact, but she recognized the underlying fear that drove both of their behaviors. "David, can I tell you what I see when I look at your situation?" she asked. He nodded, giving her his full attention in the way that was becoming familiar and comforting. "I see someone who's so afraid of repeating his childhood experience of powerlessness that he's created a different kind of prison for himself," Sarah said carefully. "You've built walls of control so high that they're keeping out everything good along with everything bad. Success, money, power, they're all just tools. But if the tools become more important than the life you're trying to build with them, then what's the point?" David stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see him processing her words with the same intensity he probably brought to complex business problems. "How did you get so wise about letting go of control?" he asked. "Because from what you told me about your situation with your husband, it sounds like you're fighting the same battle I am." The observation hit home harder than Sarah had expected, forcing her to confront her own contradictions. She was giving advice about releasing control to a man whose business empire was threatened by his micromanaging, while she herself was working extra shifts to compensate for her husband's gambling losses, trying to control an uncontrollable situation through sheer force of will. "I'm not," she admitted. "I'm terrible at it, actually. I keep thinking that if I just work hard enough, if I just cover all the bills and keep all the plates spinning, I can somehow fix what's broken in my marriage. I can't even take my own advice. Maybe that's why your advice is worth listening." "Tio," David said thoughtfully, "you understand the cost of trying to control everything because you're paying it yourself." The insight was uncomfortable but accurate, and Sarah found herself appreciating David's ability to see through her professional composure to the struggling woman underneath. "Can I ask you something?" David said, his tone shifting to something more personal. "Of course. Why are you still married to him?" "To Jake, I mean. You're obviously intelligent, capable, financially independent. You could leave tomorrow and build a life that doesn't include cleaning up someone else's messes." The question was one that Sarah had been avoiding, even in her own thoughts, because she wasn't sure she could articulate the answer in a way that made sense to anyone else. "Because I remember who he was before the gambling took over," she said slowly. "And because divorce feels like admitting that all the years I've invested in trying to save him have been wasted. And because Emma loves her father, and I can't bear the thought of taking that away from her." "Those are all reasons to stay," David acknowledged. "But what are your reasons for wanting to leave?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, surprised by how difficult it was to voice thoughts she'd been carrying for months. "I'm tired," she said finally. "I'm tired of being the only responsible adult in the relationship. I'm tired of making excuses for him to Emma when he misses her school events because he's at the casino. I'm tired of lying awake at night wondering what crisis I'm going to have to handle tomorrow." "And what keeps you from acting on that exhaustion?" David asked gently. "Fear," Sarah admitted. "Fear that I won't be able to support Emma on my own. Fear that I'm giving up too easily on someone who might still find his way back to who he used to be. Fear that leaving him will make me the kind of person who abandons people when things get difficult. David leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious. Sarah, can I tell you what I learned about fear when I was building my business? She nodded, curious about where he was going with this. Fear is information, David said. It tells you what matters to you, what you're afraid of losing, what risks you're not ready to take. But it's not a decision maker. Fear can inform your choices, but it shouldn't control them. That's easier said than done, Sarah said. Everything important is easier said than done, David replied. But the alternative is letting fear make all your decisions for you, which means you never really get to choose the life you want to live. Sarah found herself thinking about the dreams she'd shared with him the night before, about the mission work and the sense of purpose that had driven her into nursing in the first place. When was the last time she'd made a decision based on what she wanted rather than what she feared losing? What would you choose if fear wasn't a factor? David asked, as if he could read her thoughts. I don't know, Sarah said honestly. I've been making decisions based on what other people need for so long that I'm not sure I remember what I actually want. Then maybe that's the place to start, David suggested. Not with the big life-changing decisions, but with small choices. What do you want for breakfast tomorrow? What movie would you watch if you had a free evening? What book would you read if you could read anything? The question seemed almost trivial, but Sarah realized that she couldn't answer any of them easily. Her breakfast was usually whatever was quick and available between shifts. She hadn't watched a movie for pleasure in months. The last book she'd read had been a nursing textbook. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a travel writer, she said suddenly, surprising herself with the memory. Before I decided on nursing, I used to imagine myself writing about remote places, documenting different cultures, telling stories about people and places that most readers would never see otherwise. What happened to that dream? David asked. It seemed impractical, Sarah said. Travel writing doesn't exactly offer job security or health insurance. Nursing felt like the responsible choice, the safe choice. And now? Sarah thought about the question seriously, trying to imagine what it would feel like to pursue something that excited her rather than something that simply paid the bills. Now I wonder what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to try, she said. Maybe I would have failed spectacularly, but maybe I would have found a way to make it work. I'll never know because I was too afraid to find out. It's not too late, David said quietly. Dreams don't have expiration dates, remember? I'm 34 years old with a mortgage and a daughter and a husband whose gambling addiction has destroyed our financial security, Sarah said. I can't exactly pack up and travel the world, writing about exotic destinations. No, but you could start writing about the places and people you encounter right here, David suggested. Hospital patients have stories. This city has neighborhoods and communities that most people never really see. Travel writing isn't just about distance, it's about perspective, about finding the extraordinary in whatever environment you're in. The idea was intriguing in a way that Sarah hadn't felt about anything in years. She found herself imagining the stories she could tell about the people she met during her shifts, the resilience she witnessed, the small moments of grace that occurred in the midst of medical crises. I wouldn't even know how to start, she said. You start by writing, David said simply. One story, one observation, one moment that struck you as worth remembering. You don't have to quit your job or change your entire life overnight. You just have to begin. Sarah looked at him, struck by the generosity of his encouragement. Here was a man who barely knew her, offering support for dreams she'd barely acknowledged to herself. Why do you care? She asked. About my dreams, I mean, you have your own problems, your own life to figure out. David was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could see him choosing his words carefully. Because talking to you has reminded me of something I'd forgotten, he said finally. That success without fulfillment is just a very expensive form of emptiness. I've spent 20 years building an empire, but I've never built a life. Watching you rediscover what matters to you is helping me remember what I might want to matter to me." The admission created an intimacy between them that felt both thrilling and dangerous. Sarah realized that their conversations had moved far beyond the bounds of professional interaction, crossing into territory that could complicate everything about her carefully ordered life. "This is getting complicated," she said, voicing the concern that had been growing stronger with each conversation. "It is," David agreed. "Does that scare you?" Sarah considered the question honestly, weighing her fear of professional consequences against the way she felt when she was talking with David, the sense of being truly seen and understood that she hadn't experienced in years. "It should scare me more than it does," she admitted. "I should be maintaining professional boundaries, keeping our conversations focused on your medical care, protecting myself from getting involved in something that could end badly." "But," David prompted, "but I feel more like myself when I'm talking to you than I have in years," Sarah said. "For the first time in a long time, someone is asking me what I think, what I want, what I dream about. And your answers actually matter to you." "They do matter to me," David said seriously. "More than they should, probably." The acknowledgement hung in the air between them, a recognition of the connection that had developed despite all the reasons it shouldn't have. Sarah felt her heart racing, not from anxiety this time, but from the dangerous thrill of standing at the edge of something that could change everything. Before either of them could say anything else, the sound of her pager beeping broke the spell. Sarah glanced at the display and saw that she was needed for an emergency in the A. "I have to go," she said, reluctantly returning to the reality of her professional responsibilities. "I know," David said, but something in his voice suggested that he was as reluctant to end their conversation as she was. Sarah gathered her equipment and headed toward the door, but paused at the threshold when David called her name. "Sarah, what we talked about tonight, about fear and dreams and making choices, I hope you'll think about it. You deserve to have a life that belongs to you, not just one that serves everyone else's needs." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to respond without betraying how much his words meant to her. As she hurried toward the elevator, she realized that David Romano wasn't just challenging her to reconsider her professional boundaries. He was challenging her to reconsider everything about the life she'd built, everything about the woman she'd become. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The emergency call that had pulled Sarah away from David's room turned out to be a false alarm, a monitoring equipment malfunction that had triggered unnecessary panic. By the time she returned to the VIP wing an hour later, she found David's room empty, his bed neatly made, and his personal belongings gone. Her heart sank as she realized his discharge had been processed during her absence, cutting short their growing connection without warning or goodbye. At the nurse's station, Lisa looked up from her charts with a knowing expression that made Sarah's cheeks burn with embarrassment. "He left this for you," Lisa said, holding out a sealed envelope with Sarah's name written in David's distinctive handwriting. Sarah took the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, aware that Lisa was watching her reaction with the sharp attention of a friend who'd noticed something significant happening. "He seemed like a nice guy," Lisa said carefully. "Very polite, very generous with the staff. Asked a lot of questions about hospital policies and patient advocacy programs." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak as she slipped the envelope into her pocket. Whatever David had written, she wanted to read it privately, away from the curious eyes of her colleagues and the sterile environment of the hospital. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of routine tasks that felt mechanical. After the intensity of her conversations with David, every time she walked past room 815, now occupied by an elderly woman recovering from hip surgery, Sarah felt a strange sense of loss, as if something important had been taken away before she'd fully understood its value. When her shift ended at 7 in the morning, Sarah sat in her car in the hospital parking garage and opened David's letter with fingers that shook from exhaustion and anticipation. Dear Sarah, it began in the same careful handwriting she'd seen on business documents scattered across his bedside table. I'm sorry I couldn't say goodbye in person, but Dr. Martinez cleared me for discharge earlier than expected, and I didn't want to interrupt your emergency call. Our conversations over the past 3 nights have meant more to me than I know how to express. You reminded me that there's a difference between existing and living, between building an empire and building a life. I hope you'll remember what we talked about regarding your own dreams and the courage to pursue them. You have more strength than you realize, and you deserve happiness that doesn't depend on fixing everyone else's problems. I've left something with the hospital administration that I hope will help with the financial pressures you mentioned. Please don't see this as charity, but as an investment in someone whose potential I believe in completely. If you ever want to talk about writing or dreams or anything else, you can reach me at the number below. With deep respect and admiration, David. Below his signature was a phone number and a postscript that made Sarah's breath catch. P.S. I've spoken to the hospital's development office about funding a patient advocacy program. They mentioned needing someone with nursing experience and excellent communication skills to help design and implement it. The position would come with a significant salary increase and regular business hours. I thought you should know the opportunity exists. Sarah read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. David had not only thought about their conversations after she'd left his room, but he'd taken concrete steps to address the problems she'd shared with him. The financial help he'd mentioned could be the difference between losing her house and keeping her family stable, but it was the job opportunity that truly took her breath away. A patient advocacy program would allow her to use her nursing skills while helping families navigate the complex medical system, fighting for patients who couldn't fight for themselves. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work she'd dreamed about during nursing school, the chance to make a difference on a scale larger than individual patient care. But accepting either David's financial help or his professional recommendation would complicate everything about their relationship, blurring the lines between gratitude and genuine feelings in ways that might prove impossible to untangle. Sarah drove home through the morning traffic in a daze, David's letter folded carefully in her purse, and his phone number memorized, despite her best efforts to forget it. When she pulled into her driveway, she was surprised to see Jake's car still there, along with an unfamiliar sedan that made her stomach clench with apprehension. Inside the house, she found Jake sitting at the kitchen table across from a man in an expensive suit, who looked up when she entered with the predatory smile of someone who enjoyed delivering bad news. Mrs. Mitchell, the man said, rising to shake her hand with a grip that felt deliberately firm. I'm Roger Hartley from First National Bank. I was just explaining to your husband that we're going to need to accelerate the foreclosure timeline. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet as she looked from the banker to Jake's pale, defeated face. What do you mean, accelerate? The mortgage is now 4 months in arrears, Hartley explained with practiced efficiency. Our initial notice gave you 60 days to bring the account current, but additional penalties and legal fees have pushed the total owed beyond what our policy allows for extended payment plans. How long do we have? Sarah asked, though she was afraid. She already knew the answer. 30 days, Hartley said. After that, the property will be sold at auction to recover the bank's losses. Sarah sank into a chair, the impact of his words hitting her like a physical blow. 30 days was barely enough time to find an apartment, let alone come up with the money to save their house. There must be something we can do, she said, looking between Jake and the banker. A payment plan, a loan modification, something. Hartley shook his head with what might have been genuine sympathy. I'm afraid your husband's credit rating makes any additional lending impossible. The best advice I can give you is to start looking for alternative housing and consider bankruptcy to protect any remaining assets. After Hartley left, Sarah and Jake sat in their kitchen in silence, the weight of their situation settling around them like a physical presence. Emma was at school, blissfully unaware that her world was about to change in ways no 10-year-old should have to understand. "I'm sorry," Jake said finally, his voice barely audible. "I know that doesn't mean anything at this point, but I am so sorry for what I've done to us." Sarah looked at her husband, seeing the man she'd married underneath. The guilt and shame that had consumed him for years. For the first time in months, his apology felt genuine rather than defensive, as if losing their home had finally broken through the denial that had protected him from facing the consequences of his addiction. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I called the Gamblers Anonymous number," Jake said. "There's a meeting tonight, and they have a sponsor program that pairs new members with people who've been clean for years. I also talked to Dr. Peterson about counseling options that our insurance might cover." Sarah felt a flicker of hope, but it was tempered by the reality of their situation. Even if Jake got the help he needed, they would still lose their house. Still have to explain to Emma that they couldn't afford to stay in the only home she'd ever known. "It's too late, isn't it?" Jake asked, reading her expression correctly. "Even if I get clean, even if I never gamble again, the damage is already done." "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "I want to believe it's not too late, but I'm tired. Jake, I'm tired of being the only one holding everything together while you tear it apart. I'm tired of making excuses and covering for you and pretending that love is enough to fix this." Jake nodded, tears streaming down his face. "What if I moved out? Not forever, but until I can prove that I'm serious about recovery. You and Emma could stay here, and I could find a way to help with the mortgage payments." "With what money?" Sarah asked. "You haven't held a steady job in 6 months, and the mortgage is already 4 months behind." The truth of her words seemed to hit Jake like a physical blow, and Sarah watched her husband crumble under the weight of what his choices had cost their family. "I'll figure something out," he said desperately. "I'll get 2 jobs, 3 jobs. If I have to, I'll sell everything I own, ask my brother for a loan, do whatever it takes to fix this." Sarah wanted to believe him, but she'd heard variations of these promises too many times to trust them completely. Still, looking at Jake's genuine anguish, she felt some of her anger soften into sadness for the man he'd become and the dreams they'd shared that seemed impossible to salvage. "Okay," she said quietly. "You can move out, get the help you need, and we'll see what happens. But Jake, this is your last chance. If you gamble again, if you lie to me again, if you do anything that puts Emma at risk, we're done, permanently." Jake nodded frantically, relief and determination warring in his expression. "I won't let you down again, Sarah. I swear I won't." After Jake left to pack some clothes and find temporary housing, Sarah sat alone in her kitchen and pulled out David's letter. The financial help he'd mentioned could solve her immediate problems, but accepting it would mean crossing a line that might prove impossible to uncross. More than that, it would mean admitting that she couldn't handle her problems on her own, that she needed rescuing by a man she'd known for 3 days. But as she thought about Emma coming home from school to learn that they might have to move, about the look of defeat on Jake's face, about the 30-day deadline that hung over them like a sword, Sarah realized that her pride might be a luxury she couldn't afford. She pulled out her phone and stared at David's number for a long time before finally finding the courage to call. "David Romano," he answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the same warmth she remembered from their late-night conversations. "It's Sarah," she said, her voice barely steady. "Sarah Mitchell, I got your letter." "Sarah," David said, and she could hear genuine pleasure in his voice. "I was hoping you'd call. How are you, honestly?" "I'm drowning," Sarah admitted. "Jake's gambling has gotten worse, The bank is foreclosing on our house, and I have 30 days to figure out how to keep my daughter from losing her home." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Sarah to wonder if she'd said too much, shared too much, crossed too many boundaries in a single phone call. "Where are you right now?" David asked finally. "At home. Jake just left, and Emma won't be back from school for a few hours. Can I come over? I know it's presumptuous, but I'd rather have this conversation in person." Sarah hesitated, aware that inviting David to her home would represent another step across the line that separated professional acquaintance from something much more personal and complicated. "Okay," she said finally. "But David, I need you to understand that I can't pay you back, at least not anytime soon. Whatever you're offering, it would have to be—" "Sarah," David interrupted gently, "let's talk when I get there. Can you text me your address?" An hour later, Sarah watched through her front window as an understated but obviously expensive sedan pulled into her driveway. David emerged wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt that somehow managed to look more costly than most people's formal wear. But his casual clothes made him seem more approachable, less like the intimidating businessman and more like the thoughtful man she'd gotten to know during their hospital conversations. When she opened the front door, David smiled with what seemed like genuine warmth, but she could see concern in his eyes as he took in her appearance. Sarah realized she must look as exhausted and overwhelmed as she felt. "Thank you for coming," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I'm sorry about the mess. I haven't had much time for housekeeping lately." David glanced around the modest but comfortable living room, taking in the family photos on the mantel, Emma's art projects displayed on the refrigerator, the lived-in quality that spoke of a home filled with love even as it struggled with financial pressures. "It's perfect," he said simply. "It feels like a real home, not a showplace." Sarah gestured toward the couch and settled into the chair across from him, maintaining some physical distance even as she prepared to discuss the most personal details of her financial situation. "The foreclosure timeline has been accelerated," she said without preamble. "We have 30 days instead of 60, and the amount owed is more than Jake originally told me. Even if I work double shifts for the rest of the year, I can't earn enough to catch up." David listened without interruption, his attention focused entirely on her words in the way that had made their hospital conversations feel so significant. "What would it take to stop the foreclosure?" he asked when she finished explaining the situation. $18,000 to bring the mortgage current, plus whatever legal fees have accumulated," Sarah said. "It might as well be $80 million for all the chance I have of raising it. What if I could provide that?" David asked quietly. Sarah had expected the offer, but hearing it spoken aloud still took her breath away. "David, that's an enormous amount of money. I couldn't possibly accept that kind of help from someone I barely know." "But you do know me," David said, leaning forward slightly. "Maybe not for very long, but you know me in ways that matter. You know that I grew up poor, that I understand what it feels like to lose your home through no fault of your own. You know that I have more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, and that helping you would make me happier than any business deal I've ever closed." Sarah felt tears threatening as she struggled with the magnitude of his generosity and her own discomfort with accepting help. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "What do you get out of it?" "I get to know that a woman I care about doesn't have to choose between working herself to death and losing her home," David said simply. "I get to know that a little girl doesn't have to change schools because her father made bad choices. I get to use my money for something that actually matters instead of just accumulating more wealth I don't need." "David, I can't let you solve my problems for me," Sarah said, even as part of her wanted desperately to accept his offer. "It's not fair to you, and it would change everything between us in ways that might not be healthy for either of us. Would it?" David asked. "Or would it just remove one major source of stress so we could focus on figuring out what we mean to each other without the pressure of financial crisis. The question forced Sarah to examine her own motivations, to separate her pride from her practical needs, her fear of dependence from her genuine feelings for the man sitting across from her. "What would you want in return?" she asked. "Nothing," David said firmly. "This isn't a transaction, Sarah. It's not a loan with terms or an investment expecting returns. It's a gift from someone who has the means to help and who cares about your well-being." "But what if things don't work out between us?" Sarah pressed. "What if we try to build something together and it falls apart? Would you regret helping me?" David was quiet for a moment, considering her question seriously. "The only thing I would regret is knowing that I could have helped and chose not to. Whatever happens between us personally, you're a good mother, a skilled nurse, and a woman who deserves security for herself and her daughter. That's reason enough for me to help." Sarah looked around her living room, thinking about Emma's laughter echoing through these rooms, about the memories they'd built within these walls, about the security and stability this house represented for her daughter's future. "If I accept your help," she said slowly, "it has to be with clear boundaries. This can't be the beginning of a relationship where you solve my problems, and I owe you my gratitude. We have to be equals, or we can't be anything at all." "Agreed," David said without hesitation. "And Sarah, I hope you'll consider the job opportunity I mentioned as well. Not because you need rescuing, but because you'd be brilliant at patient advocacy work, and because you deserve a career that fulfills you." Sarah felt something shift inside her, a recognition that David was offering her not just financial relief, but a chance to rebuild her life on terms that honored both her capabilities and her dreams. "Okay," she said, the word coming out stronger than she'd expected. "Yes, I'll accept your help with the house. And yes, I'll apply for the patient advocacy position. But David, this changes things between us. If we're going to explore whatever we have to do it honestly, without the complication of me owing you everything." David smiled, the expression transforming his entire face with genuine joy. "I wouldn't want it any other way." As he pulled out his phone to call his bank and arrange the transfer of funds that would save her home, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the desperate hope that had sustained her through months of covering for Jake's addiction, but real hope based on genuine possibilities and the support of someone who saw her potential rather than just her problems. When Emma came home from school an hour later, she found her mother and David sitting at the kitchen table, sharing coffee and talking about the patient advocacy program as if it were a foregone conclusion that Sarah would get the position. "Mom, who's this?" Emma asked with the direct curiosity of a 10-year-old who wasn't yet old enough to be shy around strangers. "This is David Romano," Sarah said, surprised by how natural it felt to introduce him to her daughter. "He's a friend of mine from the hospital. Are you a doctor?" Emma asked David, settling into the chair beside her mother with the easy confidence of a child who is used to being welcomed into adult conversations. "No, I was a patient," David explained. "Your mom took very good care of me when I wasn't feeling well. She's the best nurse in the whole hospital," Emma said matter-of-factly. "She always knows how to make people feel better." David smiled at Sarah over Emma's head, and she saw in his expression a recognition of what she'd tried to tell him about the rewards of nursing, about the satisfaction that came from making people feel less afraid during their worst moments. "She really is," David agreed, and something in his tone made Sarah's heart flutter with an emotion she was finally ready to acknowledge. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't revolve around crisis management and damage control. A future where she could pursue meaningful work, where Emma could grow up in a stable home, where she might build a relationship with someone who valued her for who she was rather than who she could become if she just tried harder. As David prepared to leave, promising to call her the next day with updates about the bank transfer and the job application process. Sarah realized that accepting his help hadn't made her feel diminished or dependent. Instead, it had made her feel empowered, as if she were finally strong enough to accept support without losing herself in the process. "Thank you," she said as he reached the front door. "Not just for the money, but for seeing something in me that I'd forgotten was there." "Thank you for letting me help," David replied. "And Sarah, what I see in you isn't something you'd lost. It's something that was always there, just waiting for the right moment to emerge." After he left, Sarah sat on her front porch and watched. The sun set over the neighborhood she'd thought she might have to leave. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe fully, like the future held possibilities instead of just problems. She thought about the writing dreams she'd shared with David, about the patient advocacy work that could combine her nursing skills with her desire to fight for people who needed protection. Most of all, she thought about the man who'd walked into her life as a patient and might just have become her salvation in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with hope. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the gleaming conference room of St. Mary's Hospital, presenting her quarterly report on the patient advocacy program to a room full of administrators, doctors, and board members. The numbers on her PowerPoint slide told a story of success that exceeded everyone's expectations. Patient satisfaction scores had increased by 30%. Medical error reports had dropped significantly, and the program had already helped over 200 families navigate complex medical situations. "The key to the program's effectiveness," Sarah explained, clicking to her next slide, "is meeting families where they are emotionally, not where we think they should be medically. When someone receives a devastating diagnosis or faces an unexpected medical crisis, their ability to process information and make rational decisions is severely compromised. Our advocates serve as bridges between the medical team's expertise and the family's emotional reality." Dr. Patricia Williams, the hospital's chief administrator, nodded approvingly from her seat at the head of the conference table. "Sarah, the feedback we've received from patients and their families has been overwhelmingly positive. The Romano Foundation's initial funding has allowed us to expand the program faster than we originally projected." Sarah felt her cheeks warm at the mention of David's foundation, though she'd grown more comfortable over the months with the connection between her professional success and their personal relationship. The patient advocacy program had been her vision and hard work, but David's financial support had made it possible to hire additional staff and provide services that would have taken years to develop through traditional hospital funding channels. "What's next for the program?" asked Dr. Martinez, Sarah's former cardiology colleague who'd become one of the program's strongest supporters. "We're developing partnerships with 3 other hospitals in the Chicago area to replicate our model," Sarah said, unable to keep the excitement out of her voice. "We're also launching a training program for nurses who want to transition into advocacy work, and I'm writing a manual that will help other hospitals implement similar programs." The writing project had begun as a practical necessity, but it had evolved into something much more personal. Working on the manual had rekindled Sarah's love of storytelling, and she'd started a blog documenting the human stories behind medical statistics. Her posts about patients who'd overcome impossible odds, families who'd found strength in the darkest moments, and healthcare workers who went above and beyond their job descriptions had gained a following that surprised her. The Romano Foundation has also expressed interest in funding a research component, Dr. Williams added. They want to document the long-term outcomes of patients who receive advocacy support compared to those who navigate the system alone. After the meeting ended, Sarah gathered her materials and headed back to her office, a small but bright space that looked out over the hospital's healing garden. The transition from night shift nursing to day shift advocacy work had been more challenging than she'd anticipated, requiring her to develop new skills in case management, insurance navigation, and conflict resolution. But every day brought stories that reminded her why the work mattered. Her desk was covered with thank you cards from families she'd helped, photos of patients who'd recovered from serious illnesses, and letters from nurses who'd been inspired by her career transition. In the center of it all was a framed photo of Emma at her school's science fair, proudly displaying a volcano project that had won first place in her grade. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from David. "How did the presentation go? I'm betting you knocked their socks off." She smiled as she typed back, "Mission accomplished." The board approved expansion to 3 more hospitals. "Dinner tonight to celebrate?" "Absolutely. I'll pick you up at 7. Emma's invited too, obviously. The casual inclusion of Emma in their plans still made Sarah's heart flutter, even after months of watching David navigate the complexities of dating a single mother with natural grace. He'd never tried to replace Jake in Emma's life, but he'd carved out his own space as a trusted adult who showed up for school events, helped with homework, and treated Emma's opinions and feelings with the same respect he showed everyone else. Jake had been true to his word about getting help for his gambling addiction. He'd completed a 90-day inpatient treatment program and had been attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings religiously. He'd found a job in construction with his brother's company and had been making regular child support payments for the past 4 months. Most importantly, he'd rebuilt a relationship with Emma that was based on consistency and honesty rather than grand gestures and broken promises. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, a process that had been surprisingly amicable given the circumstances. Jake had signed over his rights to the house without contest, acknowledging that his gambling had forfeited any claim to the stability Sarah had worked so hard to maintain. They'd agreed on a custody arrangement that gave Jake supervised weekend visits until he'd completed a year of sobriety, at which point they would reassess. Sarah had worried about how Emma would handle the divorce, but her daughter had adapted with the resilience that children often showed when the adults in their lives finally stopped pretending that dysfunction was normal. "I like it better when Dad visits on weekends," Emma had told her one evening while they worked on homework together. "He pays attention to me instead of always thinking about gambling. And he doesn't make you sad anymore." The observation had been both heartbreaking and liberating. Confirmation that children noticed far more than adults gave them credit for, and that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for a child was to stop trying to hold together a relationship that had already broken. Sarah's computer chimed with an email notification, and she looked up to see a message from a literary agent who discovered her blog. The subject line read, "Book proposal opportunity, patient advocacy stories." Sarah's pulse quickened as she opened the email and read the agent's request for a meeting to discuss turning her blog posts into a book about healthcare advocacy and the human stories that drove systemic change. The possibility of publication felt surreal, like a dream she'd abandoned so long ago that she'd forgotten it was still possible. But over the past months, as she'd written about her work and the patients she'd helped, Sarah had rediscovered the joy of crafting narratives that could educate and inspire readers. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts about book deals and literary agents. "Sarah Mitchell," she answered, using the professional tone she'd developed for her advocacy work. "Ms. Mitchell, this is Jennifer Chun from the MacArthur Foundation," the caller said, and Sarah nearly dropped the phone. The MacArthur Foundation was known for its Genius Grants, prestigious fellowships awarded to individuals whose work showed exceptional creativity and potential for societal impact. "We've been following your work with patient advocacy and healthcare reform," Jennifer continued. "Your program at St. Mary's has caught the attention of our Healthcare Initiative Committee, and we'd like to discuss the possibility of a fellowship that would allow you to expand your work nationally." Sarah found herself speechless, struggling to process the magnitude of what was being offered. A MacArthur Fellowship would provide funding and recognition that could transform her advocacy work from a local program into a national movement. "I'm honored that you would consider my work," Sarah managed to say. Could you tell me more about what the fellowship would involve? The grant would provide financial support for you to develop a comprehensive training program for patient advocates, create standardized protocols that could be implemented in hospitals nationwide, and document the outcomes of advocacy interventions. Through longitudinal research, Jennifer explained, we see your work as having the potential to fundamentally change how healthcare institutions support patients and families during medical crises. After scheduling a follow-up call for the next week, Sarah sat in her office in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the struggling nurse who'd been working double shifts to avoid foreclosure 6 months ago with the woman who was now being considered for one of the most prestigious fellowships in the country. Her phone buzzed with another text from David, running early. Can I pick you up at 6:30 instead? Sarah gathered her things and headed out to the parking garage, her mind still reeling from the day's events. The elevator was empty, giving her a moment to process everything that had happened since David Romano had walked into her life as a patient in need of cardiac monitoring. The relationship that had developed between them had surprised everyone, including themselves. What had started as professional care had evolved into friendship, then attraction, and finally into love that was both passionate and steady, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than desperation or convenience. David had been patient with her need to maintain independence, understanding that accepting his help with the mortgage had been difficult enough without adding the pressure of romantic expectations. He'd waited for her to be ready for more, supporting her career transition and celebrating her successes without trying to take credit for them. When they'd finally moved their relationship beyond friendship, it had felt natural and inevitable, like coming home to a place she'd been searching for without knowing it existed. David brought out parts of Sarah's personality that had been dormant for years, encouraging her ambition and creativity, while respecting her dedication to Emma and her work. Sarah found David waiting by his car in the parking garage, leaning against the hood with the easy confidence that had attracted her attention from their first conversation. He was wearing dark jeans and a navy sweater that made his green eyes even more striking. And when he smiled at her approach, she felt the same flutter of attraction that had caught her off guard during their late-night hospital conversations. You look like someone who just received very good news, David said, pulling her into a hug that felt like the best part of her day. I did, Sarah said, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the soap he used. Actually, I received several pieces of very good news, and I'm not sure how to process any of them. Tell me everything, David said, opening the passenger door for her with the old-fashioned courtesy that Emma had noticed and started imitating in her interactions with classmates. As they drove through the Chicago traffic toward Sarah's house, she told him about the board meeting's success, the literary agent's interest in her blog, and the call from the MacArthur Foundation. David listened with the focused attention she'd come to treasure, asking thoughtful questions and celebrating each piece of news as if it were his own achievement. A MacArthur Fellowship, he said, shaking his head in amazement. Sarah, do you understand how extraordinary that is? There are probably 50,000 healthcare workers in this country who would give anything for that kind of recognition. It's not official yet, Sarah cautioned, though she couldn't keep the excitement out of her voice. They're just exploring the possibility. They don't explore possibilities with people unless they're serious about the outcome, David said with the authority of someone who'd navigated enough high-stakes negotiations to recognize genuine interest. This is going to happen, Sarah. You're going to change healthcare advocacy for the entire country. The pride in his voice made Sarah's chest tight with emotion. David celebrated her successes with an enthusiasm that never felt forced or performative, genuinely thrilled by her achievements in a way that made her feel truly seen and valued. What about Emma? Sarah asked, voicing the concern that had been nagging at her since the phone call. A national fellowship would mean travel, conferences, time away from home. I can't accept an opportunity that would shortchange my responsibilities as a mother. Emma's 10 years old, not 2, David pointed out gently. She's old enough to understand that her mother is doing important work that helps other families. Besides, you wouldn't be traveling constantly, and when you do need to be away, she has people who love her and can take care of her. The casual reference to himself as one of Emma's caregivers made Sarah's heart flutter. Over the months, David had seamlessly integrated himself into their family routines, attending parent-teacher conferences, helping with school projects, and providing the kind of steady male presence that Emma had been missing during Jake's worst periods of addiction. "Have I told you lately that I love you?" Sarah asked, reaching across the console to take his hand. "Not since this morning," David said with a grin. "But I never get tired of hearing it." They pulled into Sarah's driveway just as Emma was getting off the school bus, her backpack bouncing as she ran toward the car with the enthusiasm that marked the end of another successful day. "David," she called, throwing herself into his arms with the complete trust that children reserve for adults who'd proven themselves reliable. "Guess what happened in art class today?" "Tell me everything," David said, lifting her off the ground in a hug that made her giggle. As they walked into the house together, Emma chattering about her day and David listening with genuine interest, Sarah felt a contentment that was deeper than happiness. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not just romantic love, but partnership. Not just security, but growth. Not just survival, but the chance to build something beautiful. Dinner was a lively affair, with Emma recounting her school day in elaborate detail, and David sharing stories from his work that were carefully edited to be both interesting and age-appropriate. Sarah found herself marveling at how natural their family dynamic felt, how easily the three of them had settled into routines that honored each person's needs and contributions. After Emma went to bed, Sarah and David settled on the couch with glasses of wine, the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned to be themselves in each other's presence. "I have something to tell you," David said, and something in his tone made Sarah look up from her wine with sudden attention. "What is it?" she asked, noting the mixture of nervousness and excitement in his expression. "I've been thinking about our future," David said, setting down his wine glass and turning to face her directly. "About what I want our life to look like, and what kind of partnership would make both of us happy." Sarah's heart began to race, sensing that David was approaching something significant. "I know we've talked about taking things slowly, about making sure Emma was comfortable with our relationship before we made any big changes," David continued. "And I think we've done that. But Sarah, I don't want to just date you anymore. I want to build a life with you." "What does that mean, exactly?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew where this conversation was heading. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. "It means I want to marry you," he said simply. "I want to adopt Emma if she and Jake are okay with it. I want to support your career ambitions and celebrate your successes and be the person you turn to when things get difficult. I want to grow old with you and help you raise an amazing daughter who already has me wrapped around her little finger." Sarah stared at the ring box, her mind racing through everything that had led to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a woman drowning in debt and disappointment, working double shifts to avoid foreclosure while her marriage crumbled around her. Now she was being offered a future that exceeded every dream she'd dared to imagine. "Sarah?" David prompted gently. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, the word coming out stronger and more certain than she'd expected. "Yes, I'll marry you." David opened the ring box to reveal a stunning but understated diamond that caught the light from the table lamp beside them. As he slipped it onto her finger, Sarah realized that this moment represented more than just an engagement. It was a celebration of the courage she'd found to accept help when she needed it, to pursue dreams she'd abandoned, to choose love over fear. "There's one more thing," David said, pulling her closer. "I want Emma to be part of the proposal too. I have something for her." He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a smaller box containing a delicate necklace with a pendant shaped like a stethoscope. "For the future doctor in the family," David explained. "Emma told me last week that she wants to be a pediatric surgeon so she can help kids feel better the way her mom helps families." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she imagined Emma's reaction to being included in their engagement, to being recognized as an essential part of their future together. "How did I get so lucky?" she asked, leaning against David's shoulder. "We both got lucky," David replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We found each other when we both needed reminding that good things can happen to good people." As they sat together on the couch where Sarah had once fallen asleep in his shirt during those early days of their relationship, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It hadn't been easy or simple, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead as they blended their lives more completely. But looking at the engagement ring on her finger, thinking about the MacArthur Fellowship that might allow her to change healthcare advocacy across the country, and imagining Emma's excitement when she learned about the engagement tomorrow morning, Sarah felt something she'd never experienced before: complete confidence in her ability to handle whatever came next. She'd learned that accepting help didn't make her weak, that pursuing dreams didn't make her selfish, and that choosing love didn't mean sacrificing independence. Most importantly, she'd learned that sometimes the most unexpected encounters could lead to the most extraordinary transformations. "I love you," she whispered against David's shoulder. "I love you too," he replied. "Both of you. All of us." Outside, the Chicago skyline glittered with lights that represented millions of individual stories, millions of people navigating their own challenges and searching for their own versions of happiness. But inside Sarah's house, 3 people had found something precious and rare: a family built on choice rather than obligation, on mutual support rather than dependency, on love that enhanced rather than diminished each person's individual potential. As Sarah fell asleep that night with David's arms around her and Emma's soft breathing audible from the next room, she realized that her story had become exactly what she'd always wanted it to be: a narrative of resilience, growth, and the beautiful unpredictability of human connection. 2 years later, Sarah stood at the altar of the small chapel overlooking Lake Michigan, her hands trembling slightly as she held David's steady gaze. The morning sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden floor where their closest family and friends had gathered to witness their wedding. Emma, now 12 and radiating confidence in her role as maid of honor, stood beside Sarah in a dress the exact shade of blue as her mother's eyes. The patient advocacy program had grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Sarah's MacArthur Fellowship had indeed materialized, launching her into a world of national conferences, policy consultations, and collaborative research that was reshaping how hospitals across America supported families during medical crises. Her book, Healing Beyond Medicine: The Power of Patient Advocacy, had become required reading in nursing schools and healthcare administration programs nationwide. But none of those achievements compared to the joy Sarah felt watching David's face as Pastor Williams asked if he would take her as his wife. The man who had once been her patient had become her partner in every sense of the word, supporting her career ambitions while building their family with the same careful attention he brought to his real estate developments. "I do," David said, his voice carrying across the chapel with absolute certainty. "I promise to love Sarah in sickness and in health, to support her dreams and share her burdens, to be the father Emma deserves and the husband Sarah has earned through her strength and grace." The vows they'd written together reflected the unique journey that had brought them to this moment. They spoke of partnership rather than possession, of growth rather than completion, of building something beautiful together while maintaining their individual identities. "I do," Sarah replied when her turn came, looking first at David and then at Emma, whose beaming smile made her heart overflow. "I promise to love you with honesty and courage, to share not just the easy moments, but the challenging ones, to build a family where everyone feels valued and supported in becoming their best selves." Jake sat in the third row with his girlfriend Maria, a kindergarten teacher he'd met at his Gamblers Anonymous sponsors barbecue. His presence at the wedding had been Emma's request, a testament to the healthy relationship he'd rebuilt with his daughter over 2 years of consistent sobriety and genuine effort to be the father she deserved. The divorce had been painful, but it had allowed all of them to create new relationships based on truth rather than hope. Lisa Chun, now Sarah's business partner in the advocacy consulting firm they'd launched together, wiped away tears as she watched her best friend marry the man who'd helped her remember her own worth. The firm, Chung Romano Advocacy Solutions, provided training and implementation support for hospitals wanting to establish their own patient advocacy programs. David's parents had flown in from Arizona, where they'd retired after his father finally received the pension he'd been promised decades earlier. Sarah had been nervous about meeting them, but they'd embraced her and Emma with warmth that spoke to the values they'd instilled in their son, despite their years of financial struggle. "By the power vested in me by the state of Illinois, Pastor Williams announced, I now pronounce you husband and wife. David, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle but full of promise, a seal on vows that represented not just romantic love, but a commitment to building something lasting together. When they broke apart, Emma launched herself at both of them, creating a three-way hug that made everyone in the chapel laugh and cheer. The reception was held at David's penthouse, which had been transformed into a garden party with flowers from the Healing Garden at St. Mary's Hospital. The view of Lake Michigan provided a stunning backdrop as guests mingled on the terrace, sharing stories about the bride and groom's unlikely meeting and remarkable journey. Dr. Williams, now a close family friend, stood to offer a toast that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. 2 years ago, Sarah Mitchell was a night shift nurse struggling to hold her family together while pursuing her calling to help others. Today, she's Dr. Sarah Romano, a MacArthur Fellow whose work has transformed healthcare advocacy across the country. But more importantly, she's a woman who found the courage to accept love when it was offered and to build something beautiful with someone who saw her potential when she couldn't see it herself. Emma took the microphone next, her 12-year-old voice clear and confident as she addressed the assembled guests. "When my mom first told me about David, I was scared that everything would change. But David didn't try to replace my dad or make me feel like I had to choose between them. He just became part of our family in a way that made everything better. He listens to my science project ideas, he helps me with math homework, and he makes my mom laugh in ways I hadn't heard in a long time. I'm really happy he's officially my stepdad now." The evening included dancing to jazz music that reminded Sarah of those first conversations in David's hospital room, when they discovered their shared appreciation for complexity and nuance. She watched Emma teaching David's elderly aunt how to do the latest TikTok dance, marveling at her daughter's confidence and social grace. Jake approached during a quiet moment, looking healthier and happier than Sarah had seen him in years. His relationship with Maria was steady and supportive, built on honesty about his addiction and commitment to continued recovery. "Thank you," he said simply, embracing Sarah with the genuine affection of someone who'd learned to separate his failures as a husband from his role as Emma's father. "For what?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "For not giving up on me completely," Jake said. "For making it possible for me to still be Emma's dad even after I destroyed our marriage. For showing me what healthy love looks like so I could recognize it when I found it with Maria." "We all deserve second chances," Sarah replied. "You've done the work to earn yours." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah found herself standing on the terrace with David and Emma, looking out over the city lights that stretched to the horizon. The three of them had become a family through choice and effort rather than accident, and the bonds they'd built felt stronger for having been deliberately created. "Mrs. Romano," David said, testing out her new name with obvious pleasure. "How does it feel to be married?" "It feels like coming home," Sarah replied honestly. "Not just to you, but to myself. To the person I was always meant to be." Emma, now taller and more mature than the 10-year-old who'd first met David in their kitchen, looked between her mother and stepfather with the wisdom that came from witnessing their relationship develop over time. "Are you going to have more kids?" she asked with the directness that never failed to surprise adults. Sarah and David exchanged glances, a conversation they'd had many times, but never with Emma present. "Would you like us to?" David asked, genuinely curious about her opinion. "Maybe," Emma said thoughtfully. "I think I'd like being a big sister. But not right away. I want to finish middle school first, and I want Mom to finish her book tour for the new book she's writing." Sarah laughed, amazed by her daughter's practical approach to family planning. Emma had inherited her mother's organizational skills and her stepfather's strategic thinking, creating a personality that was uniquely her own. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone buzzing with a text from her literary agent. The message contained a single line that made her gasp. "Hollywood production company wants to option your story for a film adaptation." "What is it?" David asked, noting her expression. "Someone wants to make a movie about us," Sarah said, showing him the text. "About how we met, about the advocacy program, about everything." Emma's eyes lit up with the excitement of a 12-year-old who just learned her family might be famous. "Can I be in it? Can I play myself?" "Slow down, sweetheart," David said, though he was grinning at the possibilities. "Let's see what they have in mind first." As they headed inside to begin their new life as a married couple, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The foreclosure notice that had once represented her worst nightmare had been the catalyst for everything good that had followed. If Jake hadn't gambled away their house payments, if she hadn't been working those extra night shifts, if David hadn't had his cardiac episode at exactly the right time to be assigned to her care, none of this would have happened. The thought was both humbling and empowering, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives contain the seeds of our greatest transformations. Sarah had learned to trust in the possibility of unexpected grace, in the way that human connections could reshape everything we thought we knew about our limitations and potential. Their wedding night was spent not in an exotic honeymoon destination, but in the home they'd built together, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life. Emma's artwork covered the refrigerator, David's business books shared shelf space with Sarah's nursing textbooks and advocacy research, and family photos documented the gradual evolution from three separate people into a cohesive unit. As Sarah fell asleep in David's arms, she thought about the nurse who'd walked into room 815 2 years ago, exhausted and overwhelmed, but still committed to providing excellent care. That woman had no idea that caring for one patient would change every aspect of her life, leading her to love, success, and fulfillment beyond anything she dared to imagine. But perhaps that was the real lesson of their story, that we never know which moment might be the one that changes everything, which act of service might open doors we didn't even know existed, which person might see in us the potential we'd forgotten we possessed. Sarah Romano, patient advocate, MacArthur Fellow, published author, and beloved wife and mother, closed her eyes and smiled, knowing that her story was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help families navigate medical crises, new chances to write about the resilience of the human spirit, and new moments to appreciate the beautiful complexity of the life she'd built with David and Emma. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and promise. A blank page waiting to be filled with the next chapter of their extraordinary, ordinary love story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.